My subject this morning is the post-World War II escape from justice of the perpetrators of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. Having investigated and prosecuted Nazi criminals for more than 25 years in the U.S. Justice Department, I've had an extended opportunity to examine key documents and discuss these issues with some of the major participants and certainly observers. The tragic reality is that the vast majority of the men and women who took part in these crimes escaped justice entirely. How did they get away? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is bound up, and has been for decades, in a fog of myths, legends, distortions, and, I'm sad to say, outright fabrications. There are times, I must confess, when I fear that the truth will never vanquish falsity regarding this subject. The myths have been buttressed, so to speak, by at least 5 decades of literary and cinematic thrillers originating from the likes of Frederick Forsyth, Robert Ludlum, John le Carré, Ira Levin, and other talented writers. So, if you'll permit me, I'd like us to look at the myths first. Here, I think, are the ways in which most people think that the perpetrators of Nazi crimes against humanity got away. 1. A super-secret escape organization of Nazis, codenamed Odessa, arranged escape routes for them. 2. The perpetrators assumed false identities, enabling them to elude Allied authorities who were searching for them. 3. U.S. intelligence agencies, the intelligence services of other nations, also the Vatican, and other Western institutions knowingly helped them escape. 4. Most of the Nazi criminals managed to find safe haven in South America, where they lived in splendor owing to the protection that they received from Latin American dictators in exchange for certain quote-unquote services that they provided. And 5. Independent Nazi hunters, among whom the most famous was, of course, Simon Wiesenthal, were able to track down Adolf Eichmann and most of the other senior perpetrators, but European and Latin American governments simply ignored the information that they provided. Well, like many myths, there are kernels of truth to each of these beliefs, but none of these beliefs, myths, individually or collectively, explains more than a very tiny component of the Nazi cases. The Odessa File, a best-selling book by Frederick Forsyth, a true page-turner, turned into a motion picture starring John Voight, very successful film. It's a myth, was invented. Were there aid groups that were where former Nazis helped one another escape? Sure. Were there groups of Nazis who banded together? Sure. Was there an organization like Odessa that existed to help Nazis escape justice and flee from their pursuers in any significant way? No, there was not. Second myth, the one about false identities. Well, you know, it's actually harder than you might think, especially back then, to get a false identity. If you were a senior perpetrator and you had the connections, maybe you could do it. Some of them certainly did. But you know what? It really wasn't necessary for most of these people to assume identities. They just had to lay low for a few years. And then after 1948, when efforts to find them dropped off precipitously, they generally could come out with their regular names. So most of them kept their given names. U.S. intelligence. There were indeed some instances in which intelligence agencies and other post-war governmental institutions helped Nazi criminals evade justice. One of the best-known cases is that of Klaus Barbie, the notorious Gestapo chief of Lyon, France, the so-called Butcher of Lyon. Among the murders that he perpetrated, members of the French resistance and Jewish school children. He was found in Bolivia in the 1980s and was eventually sent to France, where he was put on trial and convicted. He died in prison. He was, how did he get to Bolivia? He was aided by the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, which had used his services after the war. This is a picture of a German Army officer taken at Podgorica, Yugoslavia on May 22, 1943, during a vicious German operation there, codenamed Unternehmen Schwarz, the Black Operation. Thousands and thousands of people were murdered, civilians were murdered in the course of the conducting of that operation, and there he is right in the middle of it. Can't see the rest of the photo, but he's surrounded by war criminals. Anybody recognize this man?
Yeah.
Okay.
He became president or something of Austria.
That's exactly right. It's Kurt Waldheim, who spent the 70s as Secretary General of the United Nations, where he liked to call himself the Chief Human Rights Officer of the planet Earth. His Nazi past was revealed at last in 1986. He was involved in the perpetration of atrocities, and I should really say the facilitation of the perpetration of atrocities in the former Yugoslavia. It's a very long story. I wrote an entire book about it that's long out of print. As a result of the disclosure of his Nazi past, some of you will remember that Waldheim was formally barred by the United States in 1987 from ever re-entering this country. And that was in particular on the basis of proofs that were assembled by my former office. I was recused from that matter because I was involved in the Waldheim affair, so to speak, outside the Justice Department. The revelations, by the way, included discoveries that Waldheim had been charged as a Nazi mass murderer after the war by Yugoslav authorities, and had even been listed in 1948 as a wanted war criminal by, believe it or not, the United Nations War Crimes Commission. So how did he become the Chief Human Rights Officer of the planet Earth in 1971? And how did he serve 2 full terms as Secretary General through 1981 without the truth coming out until 5 years after he left office and was running successfully for the presidency of Austria? The answer is, the Yugoslav government knew the truth, but they covered up for him. So did the Soviets. In fact, in the 1971 elections to succeed Bhutan at the United Nations, the Soviets basically vetoed every other candidate, including, to the surprise of many, the Finnish ambassador. After all, back then, Finland pretty much had to do whatever was necessary to avoid conflicting with the Soviet policy. So you would have thought that the Soviets would be delighted to have a Finn as UN Secretary General, but no, they wanted Waldheim. Of course, the Finnish ambassador, Max Jakobsen, had the additional disability, so to speak, of being a Jew. Well, why did the Yugoslavs and the Soviets cover up for him? I believe it was to promote Soviet and Yugoslav intelligence operations in the United States. Back then, the UN was probably the principal base for communist intelligence operations in the United States. My long ago book on the Waldheim case explains the logic of this and the proofs of this. It's long out of print, but used copies are widely available on the internet. As to the Vatican, yes, to be sure, there was some involvement on the part of some Vatican officials in aiding Nazis who were trying to escape justice. Vatican Bishop Alois Hudal, he helped numerous Nazis get away, among them Stangl, whom he helped escape to Syria, from which the former Treblinka commandant was later able to flee to Brazil. While there were instances of assistance, even knowing assistance, given to fugitive Nazi criminals by certain Catholic Church officials, it can't seriously be suggested that these cases amounted to more than a tiny percentage of the hundreds of thousands of Nazi criminals who succeeded in evading their post-war appointment, so to speak, with justice.